Hey everybody, I'm just going to coordinate my camera positioning here. Let's see what the most feasible option is for recording in this particular room. I may just put the computer on my lap to do it. Will that be a decent? That'll work. I'll look like I have 6 chins, but that's fine. Alright, so today I'm going to read chapters 27 and 28, possibly 29. 28 is quite brief, so it will not take long to get through that section. 29 is a good deal longer, but I may get through 29 as well because it's not that much longer, and that will bring us to the final chapter and the epilogue and the appendices at the end of that. I will probably not read the appendices, or if I do, I will do it later. And when this stream is done, I'm going to go upload chapters. Let's see, I think it's 25 and 26 are the last 2 that I had read. I'm going to go upload those to YouTube so they'll be ready to go. So I'm going to start with 27. This is picking up with the attempts to take back the throne by Arvadus in Angledeus, along with his allies. So, Vendile waited anxiously for the coronation ceremony to begin. He'd outdone his first public appearance after Arvadus' death announcement, grandiose as that might have been, by clothing himself in the most brazenly decadent garb he could find. Vendile wore 10 rings, 1 on each finger and thumb, each of the most resplendent silver and bedecked with jewels. His hair was shining black and slicked neatly with wax. Vendile's robes hung over 2 feet past his boots, dragging heavily behind him. They were trimmed in the snow-colored fur of some strange creature from the north, brought in and carefully skinned at immense personal expense some years ago, when he had dreamt of this day. His tunic was as shocking and deep a violet as his robes, and over it he wore 3 heavy gold necklaces, each with a progressively larger stone, hung at varying depths over his chest. A thin metal chain held his prize pendant, given to him by Freyan beneath his thin undershirt, so its simple design would not contrast with the finery of his ensemble. Though he knew it did not mesh with his opulent appearance, Vendile was loath to be apart from the item. His odd attachment to it mattered not, for Vendile was dressed as the mightiest of kings, and all that he awaited was the refurbished crown of the Angledaic kingdom to confirm his posturing. That final piece of his triumph sat outside the marble on a dais before the steps. Outside the palace on a dais before the steps, repaired from its earlier fall. The marble floor of the entrance had been covered in deep purple runners stretching over the entire 100 feet of stairs that was the entry to the palace. They matched the long, heavy wall hangings of Vendile's house that framed the entrance. Huge braziers had been erected on either side of the stairway to hold massive blazing fires, even though the sun had not yet dipped below the horizon. Guards were on hand, most of them Vendile's personal soldiers, and the crowd of his so-called supporters was hemmed by many of them. Boehmer and Hladic knew that few would willingly attend the ceremony, so they had persuaded many nearby residents to be present with the ends of their soldiers' swords. Their willingness was of no concern. Both High Lords simply wanted a large enough crowd to satisfy their benefactor and to distract him from the noticeable absence of High Lord Calavar's paladins. Clad in their bright red robes with fine golden trim, the priests of Paladinus made their approach up the stairs, singing the ancient chant of the kingdom. Hladic, dressed slightly finer than his subordinates in a gold-weave robe and large bejeweled conical cap, led the procession. Boehmer stood next to the crown, his ruddy face nearly matching his burnished fiery armor, highlighted with shining black tints. Several of his guards stood around the doors to the palace awaiting Vendile's arrival. Hladic reached the dais just as the trumpeters were at the base of the steps, hitting their crescendo. As silence fell, he straightened his robes and began his speech in a loud, clear voice. People of Alderlass, Angledaics, and countrymen, I am here to present to you your new king, one who shall move us beyond the dark days of his predecessor into a new era of supremacy and power. I give you the one man grand enough to lead this great people into the future through his wisdom. I give you High Lord Carcyrus Vendile. There was a little cheering, though the guards attempted to prod several onlookers into rejoicing. Vendile did not seem to notice as he slowly strode through the grand high doors of the palace and down the steps. He took his time, bathing in his victory at last. Vendile's eyes were glued to the crown before him, and he did not notice when the crowd stopped watching him and began to look down the road behind them. He only paused when he was a step above the dais and the trumpets went suddenly quiet. Vendile's head shot up as he heard the sound of hooves on stone and cheering voices coming nearer and nearer. The color flew away from his face when suddenly the leading rider became clear before him. Arvadus Hawking rode to meet the new king, and he'd brought his city with him. Hladic was still frozen with his arms spread wide, the book of the code held aloft in one hand for the ceremony. Boehmer was looking around rapidly for any exit. The men below the stairs did not seem clear on what to do, but Vendile reacted quickly. Guards, stop these usurpers and traitors to the people. Take their weapons from them. They threaten the safety of our grand kingdom. Verasho, in his thin mail vest, rode to the edge of the guards, brandishing their spears. There's only one traitor here, he who drives the people into his service like beasts. We, on the other hand, come not against the people, but with them. Verasho thrust his staff aloft, and a great roar went up from the crowd behind him. Vendile could not see the end of the mass as it stretched out before him along the zenith road and atop houses and in the windows of buildings below it. Looking about wildly, he hissed at Boehmer, "You idiot! The gates were to be sealed against all travelers. How could they have gained entry?" Boehmer did not answer, but instead motioned his guards to form a line of defense before him and the would-be king. Vendile snorted at his unresponsiveness and grabbed the still frozen Hladek by the robe. "You, have your priests disperse this rabble so I can kill the hawking scum in peace." Hladek looked in the madman's eyes. "How, my lord? The people are too many, and my priests are forbidden from doing violence to anyone." Fool! Vendile hurled Hladek from him and down the steps, causing an immediate lull in the cheering of the people. Ripping a crossbow from one of the guards, he cried out shrilly to Arvadas, "I'm the rightful king, Hawking. You have lost the throne and your authority. This rabble of unwashed masses will not take it back for you. Die." Vendile aimed the crossbow hurriedly and fired. The shot went wide of Arvadas, and Graham deflected it off his shield. The riders and their guard allies from the wall drew steel and held their weapons aloft. "Surrender, Vendile," cried Arvadas. "There's no need for further bloodshed." "Quite the contrary." Vendile laughed hysterically to himself. "It seems there has not been enough. Guards, fire on the crowd. Kill anyone who doesn't get out of the way, and leave none of the traitors alive." There were over 40 men stationed around the stairs and palace, and each drew a crossbow and aimed it. A great panic went up among the crowd before the stairs as they tried to get clear. The additional 40 men holding them in panicked as well, trying to move out of the way and contain the crowd at the same time. Verasho shouted over the chaos, "Behind the walls! Get under cover!" The grand steps leading up from the raised base of the palace to its doors were flanked by low walls which mimicked the 8 elevated roads of the city. The 2 low walls nearest Arvadas and the others ran down either side of the walkway to the palace entrance. Kalavar leapt from his horse and made for the one to his left. Graham and Derek grabbed Arvadas from his horse and pulled him with them to the right. Verasho spun and shouted for the people to move back while Lena jumped down and tried to convince the guards to move away and let the people through. There was a loud and sudden twang as the crossbows all fired at once. Graham and Derek had Arvadas between them, shields raised to protect him from bolts falling over the thick white marble of the wall. Kalavar yelled for Lena, standing in the open directly before the bolts as they flew from their strings. Erindian came galloping past her and grabbed her cloak, propelling her toward the other High Lord as the bolts flew into the crowd. Verasho turned in horror, deflecting the bolt aimed at him with his staff. The innocent people crammed before the stairs were hit hard. Several guards on both sides also went down. One of the missiles hit Erindian in the arm, with which he was holding Lena, and he cried out before falling hard on the back of his horse. The people began fleeing in all directions as Vendile started screaming for another volley. Verasho rode to Erindian and pulled him to Kalavar, where he quickly dismounted, putting his back against the wall. The people of Alderlast, who had turned out in droves to support Arvadas' return, now ran desperately for shelter. Another volley of bolts ripped through those not moving fast enough. More specters went down screaming as blood began to run freely in the streets, and Arvadas was unable to tear his eyes from the carnage before him. Graham and Derek were calling over as many of the young guards as they could, but most were caught so unaware by the suddenness of the attack, and as new recruits were unprepared for such violence, that they reacted slowly. Of the 20 or so loyal servants of Hawking House they had claimed from the gate, only 15 were still left. The other 5 were either writhing on the cobblestones or worse, not moving at all. 6 of the contingent managed to join the 2 bodyguards and the king. The others, with only spears and shields for protection, went to the prince. Arvadas was stunned by the horror around him. Since entering the city, it had seemed their plan to march nobly into Alderlast and win back his home through purity of their just and true mission was going to succeed in fairy tale fashion. But this was no storybook adventure, and Arvadas was not a mythical hero. There were real men and women dying in his streets, and Vendile was a true villain, so insane with his desire to rule that even in the face of failure he would not relinquish his rapidly dwindling grip on the kingdom. The shock of reality refused to fade, and Arvadas remained unable to act for a time. Behind the opposite wall, Verasho and Kalavar propped Erindian against the barrier as Lena pressed the ripped fabric of his shirt into the wound to staunch the bleeding from his arm. "It seems," the young High Lord smiled meekly, "I'm not cut out for battle." "You're going to be fine, my lord," Lena said, tearing the lower end of his sleeve free and wrapping the cloth tightly around the wound. "Just stay still and hold that cloth down for me, will you?" "You are all right, my lady?" the injured man asked her. "She's fine, you oaf. Look after yourself," Kalavar grunted, his gruffness doing little to hide his obvious concern for his fellow High Lord. Runadin tested the weight of his warhammer in one hand. "Not much we can do without bows of our own." Renan appeared beside him, dragging a wounded soldier. "Miss, if you could look after him next." But then the wounded man's face froze and his body went stiff. Renan screamed in frustration. Gods be damned, I'll carve that foul beast's heart from his body. You're going to do no such thing, Varasho said gravely. We have to move, flank them somehow, or we're done for. You and Lena stay with Arindian and protect him. Varasho turned to the paladin commander. Kalavar? Yes, my lord. We need to move around to them to the left. Any suggestions? The High Lord peeked over the lip of the wall from under his shield. I do not rightly know, lad. There's a lot of those damned crossbows up there, and I don't think they'll be running out of bolts any time soon. We do have shields, yes? Aye, small ones, though, and only 9 men and myself to carry them. That's plenty. You men, shields in front and get ready to leap the wall. We'll get as far towards their position as we can before making the jump over to the steps. If we rush them, we might be able to catch them off guard. Kalavar, stay close to the rear, and when I say, duck down with your shield over your head. You understand? The High Lord looked confused, but he nodded. Varasho filed in behind his men. Shields over your heads until I give the word. Move. Lena watched them go before turning back to Arindian. Renan examined the wound and looked at her. You should be all right. It's not too deep. The dark-haired woman met his gaze. I think we're going to have worse to deal with before the day is over. At the other side of the steps, Arvadas had just managed to tear his eyes away from the terrible death and destruction around him when Graham grabbed his shoulder and shook him. My lord, the prince appears to be making some sort of maneuver. Arvadas watched his son round the corner with the few guards he had. The king glanced over his own wall at the imposing sight of Vendile and his crossbow-wielding guards. He's trying to catch them unaware. It's no good. Vendile can see them moving. We have to do something. Derek suddenly rounded the corner and charged up the steps, sword drawn. Graham grabbed for him, but missed. Derek, what are you doing? Arvadas caught the older guard as he started to rise. Wait, Graham, don't be a fool. My lord. Graham tried to shake Arvadas free, his voice caught in his throat. There's no way he can make it. I'm your king, and I'm giving you an order. Stay here. The commanding nature of his king's voice caused Graham to turn, stunned, and stare at Arvadas in disbelief. But such was his long-ingrained sense of deference to the man that he did not move. But his eyes did turn to follow Derek's progress up the steps. The young guard was howling something incoherent as he charged. He had time to move well. The crossbowmen were all reloading as he started his rush. Derek reached the first plateau before the guards could adjust to his approach. He rammed his shield in the face of one foe, and slashed the other's legs out from under him with his blade. The other 2 men drew their short swords and rushed him. Varasho caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and yelled to his men, Go now! The prince's contingent hopped the wall a few feet behind Derek, and they charged forward. The now ready crossbowmen were confused, but most were still trained on the young guard. Derek deflected one of the swords to the stone at his feet and bashed his shield into the other blade-bearing enemy. He did not see the 3 bolts that raced towards him, and was so baffled when they landed in his chest, knocking him back and onto the stairs. Graham and Arvadas had just started up the steps when he went down, and the older guard cried out as though the bolts had hit him as well. Arvadas and Graham made for the downed companion while the guards with them joined Varasho's men. Kalavar ducked and held his shield high as Varasho rushed forward, leaping off the shield and spinning into the largest group of guards. Kalavar raced around the platoon of men and began swinging his hammer about, smashing heads and limbs left and right. The assault was so brutal, and the guards from Vendile's contingent began to fold quickly. Several ran for the palace, and a few threw down their weapons and knelt in submission. Those still desperate enough to fight packed in around the dais and met the brunt of Varasho's assault. The prince was mowing through the unprepared soldiers and had nearly reached the tyrannical High Lord responsible for all this carnage. Vendile saw his men faltering and did not stay to see the outcome of the fight. He snatched the crown from the pedestal on which it was resting and bolted for the palace, leaving Bwemmer to defend the entrance. The High Lord did not move from his position since the fighting began. It was as if the repercussions of his actions had just been made clear to him. With a wave, he spoke quietly to his men. Lay down your arms. We're done here. Vendile's guards kept fighting, but Varasho dropped the last resisting man, turning to address Bwemmer. The eldest Hawking's son prepared to berate the man for his cowardice, when Arvadas shouted from behind, and despite the incoherence of his words, Varasho knew from their tone they were a warning. Suddenly a dagger flew past the prince's face, narrowly missing his cheek, and striking a skulking Vendile loyalist about to jump Varasho from behind. The dagger buried in the man's throat, killing him instantly. Varasho looked towards the direction it had come from and saw Lena striding up the steps. I told you to stay with Arindian. Lena glared at him. No need to thank me, Prince. I'm not sitting idly by while good men die for my country. Only 2 of the guards from the gate had been killed in the assault, mostly due to the heroic effort of Derek. Graham knelt beside his friend, cradling his head. Derek coughed and specks of blood flecked his chin, yet he smiled. No crying, old friend. Not over me. Graham shook his head in frustration. What possessed you? Why? Derek coughed again and forced a bloody smile. Remember what you told me in the palace? You're too old for this. Graham sobbed. Of course, boy, of course, but you're too young for this, far too young. No, remember. My life for the king. Derek smiled once more as his eyes began to fade to glass. It was an honor. The gasping and wheezing shakes of Derek's body did not last long. Graham held his stiffening form and sobbed uncontrollably on the steps. Arvadas stood behind him, watching, but not interfering. In that moment, Derek's salute toward Arvadas as he had marched under unlawful arrest to the palace came clearly to the king's mind. The boy had fulfilled his promise, and all because Arvadas had allowed Derek to die in order to retake the steps of his palace. His conscience weighed heavily. Arvadas turned from the scene to see Brucius Hladek, attempting to rise from the stone of the steps where Vendile had flung him. The returning king approached the struggling form and kicked him onto his back, pinning him with one foot. "Do not move, High Lord. You're not going anywhere." Lena appeared beside Arvadas, her eyes wide with shock and despair as she spotted the body of Derek. The king was about to console her when Verasho turned around and addressed them all. "My lord, we must capture Vendile now, before he can raise more men and do our home more harm than he already has." Arvadas stepped harder on Hladek. "Get your priests into the streets and help the injured, and do not even consider trying to flee, or I promise you, I will hunt you down with dogs and let them finish you when they catch up." The king released his pressure on the High Lord and went to join his son. "Let's end this now." Lena picked up a blade from the steps. "I'm coming too." Verasho turned to admonish her and send her to wait with the others, but Arvadas spoke first. "Bring anyone who's willing. We must all face down this vile usurper if we have a chance to cleanse this kingdom." Arvadas strode past Verasho and Lena went to follow, but the prince grabbed her arm. "Please, Lena, stay here. I don't want anything to happen to you." The young woman pulled free of his hand. "That man in there is responsible for killing Derek and all the pain and grief Graham feels right now. They are my friends as much as yours, and this is my battle as much as yours. I'm going, and you can't stop me." She marched up the stairs and joined the few guards from Alinormir's cradle who were waiting to storm the palace. Arvadas had paused on the steps beside Bwemmer, who removed a signet ring and handed it to the king. "My lord, I've betrayed my people and you personally. I allowed myself to be blinded by desire for wealth and status, and have done grievous harm to too many people. I tied myself to a madman. I hereby abdicate my position as High Lord for that betrayal to this land and our code." Arvadas glanced down at the ring and then at Bwemmer. "What you say is correct." He retrieved the ring from the High Lord's hand. "I accept your abdication. These guards will take you and your men to my home and keep you there until I can decide what's to be done with you." Bwemmer nodded solemnly and departed under his watchful escort down the Zenith Road. Arvadas watched him go, and then turned to Kalavar and Verasho. We shall have to do this deed ourselves. No time to raise more guards, and I can't allow him to go on his own, or he might try to escape justice." Verasho grabbed one of the surrendered Vendile soldiers by his hair and wrenched his head back. "How many of you are within? What dogs does your master still keep kennelled?" The man cried out in pain and blubbered, "None, none. We were all to be outside for the coronation. Only his bandit advisor is still inside." Verasho looked at Arvadas questioningly, and the king grunted in understanding. "Freyan. He should not be a threat to us." Arvadas turned to the doors and heaved them open. Kalavar and Verasho filed in behind him, and Lena kept protectively in the rear. As they strode through the massive entryway, Lena glanced back to see Graham still cradling Derek's body on the steps. A quiet rage built inside her, and she hefted her newfound sword as she passed into the dark halls of the palace. The doors slammed shut behind them, as the priests hurried down the steps to aid the wounded. A frigid wind still swirled around Mount Iceblade, and something in it jerked Roman out of his death-like sleep. He glanced to either side and saw Edge and Raymir had also drifted off into slumbers, and their minds and bodies consumed by exhaustion. Roman jumped up and looked over the brink of the outcrop. He saw no sign of the strange figure Edge had claimed to have seen, and breathed a little easier. Roman did not really believe Saltilian had followed them this far, and it was hard enough to fathom that they had made it this far themselves, but the tiniest possibility still sent a shiver down his spine, not born from the cold. Turning around, he gently shook both of the others awake. Edge was up almost immediately upon being touched, brandishing his weapon, but relaxed when he saw it was only Roman. Raymir came to more slowly, but was soon ready to move. Roman glanced above them, where he could see clearly the peak now in the empty, cloudless sky. Edge stepped next to him and patted him on the back. "Not much farther." Raymir called them over. "There's a path over here. It looks safe enough." The three filed into a tight line, with Raymir between the two men and Edge in the lead. Edge found the going incredibly easy for so high up the mountain, especially after their previous ordeals among the rock face. The path was not so steep, and they took their time as much as they could. Edge kept glancing back to make sure he didn't outpace his companions, and Roman did the same, but more to keep himself believing they were not being followed. The walk went on for some hours, and finally they crested a last steep rise, sharper than the more established walkway they'd taken. Edge came over the top first and paused. He could see for what seemed to be hundreds of miles in the distance, massive plains of white snow interspersed with sharp teeth of rock. Raymir and Roman stood beside him, taking in the sights. Edge began gesturing in wonder. "There to the south and east. That's where we came from among all those mountains and the snows beyond. And over here, in the west, that's the sea out there somewhere that Wolfbane and I crossed to reach the shore." Raymir pointed southward. "Look, the mountains extend even further, down to the warmer lands." Roman chuckled. "All I see is snow and ice. I'm not even sure there are warm lands anymore." Raymir laughed with him, but Edge silenced them with a sudden raising of his hand. "This tower spire's not here. Do you have your spyglass still, Romond? Yes. The older man pulled his carefully wrapped prize free and extended the collapsible lengths of metal. I'll start scanning in the west or the north. Compromise, Raymer said lightly. Start to the northwest. All right. Roman smiled broadly and put the device to his left eye, closing the right. He held it upward and talked as he began to search the horizon. It's fortunate the sky cleared just as we reached the top. I can see farther than I would have if the clouds and snow were still. Concerned, Raymer brought up her head from where it had been resting on Edge's shoulder. What is it, Roman? Without a word, he held his device outward and stepped to the side, but did not take his eyes off the direction he had been staring in. Raymer took the spyglass and stared through it. Edge heard her sharp intake of breath and came to join them, taking the lens from her as she too looked uncomfortably in the direction Roman had. As Edge took in the same sight as the other two, a great quiet fell over all of them. That, he breathed, must be what we're looking for. Rising out of the pure white snow, like an impaling blade, was a massive tower, still a great distance from the mountain top on which they stood. Even from that far off with a spyglass they could see the sharp, cruel edges that made up its form. The tower seemed to bend and swirl upon itself as it rose in the sky, a massive height and width to be so clearly seen from so far away, even with the device's enhancement of their vision. The form was nightmarish, with no apparent rhyme or reason to its structure that would have made it accommodating to even the most eccentric master. It was as though it had grown independently, as a living thing, expanding wherever it found room to extend its sharp contours. Despite the clear sky of the early evening, a massive dark cloud hung over the area about the tower, the occasional crackle of strange color lancing out of the sky to strike its dark form. About its base, a large grove of foreboding black trees grew, wavering in the distant breeze. Roman took a deep breath. So that's our destination. It does not look particularly inviting from here. Edge did not respond, but glanced at Raymer. She returned his look and said softly, It has to be the place. What else would it be? Oh, I assure you, it is. The two spun to meet a horrific sight. Saltillion stood there, snow rising above his ankles in his dark, tattered robes. He gripped his shimmering staff with bloodied fingers, nearly all the nails having been ripped off in his delirious climb to the peak. The heavy cowl that hung loosely over the shoulders of his robe hid his face. All his finery had been worn down, so that Saltillion now resembled some nightmarish caricature of a wizard, having been harried and worked to the bone, degrading aggressively the cloth he had been wandering in. Edge reacted swiftly, and grabbing his halberd, he started forward with a determined step. It was the only step he took, for Saltillion's eyes shot up, and instantly the lost elf froze where he was. His otherworldly gaze passed over the other two, pausing on Raymer a moment before returning to Edge. All three of them found themselves immobilized, frozen as stiffly as the ice around them. Saltillion smiled, revealing cracked and red lips with blood oozing through his teeth. His eyes danced madly within the hood. Oh, no, my dear lieutenant. You're not going anywhere. Saltillion's lisp began to fade, and his voice took on an otherworldly tone. You see, this journey has destroyed my physical body, but it has unleashed a power in me beyond my corporeal limitations. However, I will leave your mouths free to work so that the lady will hear every beautiful scream of pain as I rend you unmade before her eyes. The madman began to approach Edge as Raymer strained to cry out at him in rage. Leave him alone, you beast. Don't touch him. Saltillion paused and smiled at her. Oh, don't worry, my dear. It will all be over soon. Trem slept fitfully, dreamlessly on the floor of the cavern. He'd found it difficult to fall asleep in the minutes or hours that passed, for he could not tell how long he'd struggled, or he woke frequently as he shifted on the hard ground. Trem felt a strong, sharp pain pull him at last to true wakefulness. He shot up from his bedroll and snapped back to reality. He glanced to the right, where Neep and Diaga were both still slumbering. He was still in the cavern with the refugees and his companions. Trem relaxed a moment, understanding that in his broken bits of sleep he had lost his sense of place. He searched for the cause of the sudden pain that had woken him, expecting a rock beneath his roll, but he could not find one. He shook his head and rubbed his matted hair, trying to clear his mind of fogginess and fatigue and limited rest. Realizing he could not return to bed, even if he needed to, he rose and made for the edge of the cavern, where the road, according to Gend, continued to the other side. Trem found he was not the only one who couldn't sleep. Ghost stood by the exit to the cave, sharpening his blade once again near a small flame. The Napoleon simply nodded in acknowledgement. Soon it became clear that almost everyone who had been thrown together since Skylar Hill was there. Javanaleth and Logan were leaning against the rock wall, talking quietly. Grimtooth sat tossing a throwing axe in one hand. Gend and Wrath were standing quietly to the side, the halfling conspicuously avoiding eye contact with anyone while the assassin seemed determined to force it. Trem lifted his head questioningly at Logan. Trouble sleeping? The knight nodded. You too. All of us, except the mage, and he seems to be so spent an earthquake wouldn't rouse him. Joven shook his head. Something's not right here. I have a bad feeling in this place. Ghost stopped sharpening his sword and shrugged resignedly. We can't change course now. There's only one way. Trem agreed. He's right. The half-elf reached into his travel pack, which he was holding by the straps that dangled at its side, pulling out his small container of teas. Would anyone like something to warm the blood? I'll take some, Joven said, coming forward. The two scrounged the area about them quietly for something to boil water in, which Ghost poured sparingly, as he insisted that they not use too much of their limited supply. Logan turned down the opportunity for refreshment, but Grimtooth, and surprisingly to most wrath, produced cups that accepted one of the darker leaf varieties Trem had selected. They soon sat about the low fire, cross-legged and sipping the bitter concoction, happy for some small comfort. I don't like it down here, Ghost grumbled, leaning against the wall and looking down the long unlit path that was to take them south. Too dark, disorienting. Those shafts of light near the doors tell you the sun is out, but not the time of day. The road looks worse, no light at all. Impossible to tell how long we've traveled or slept. We'll just have to move when we can and rest when we tire, Trem said. Aye, Grimtooth said, sitting serenely beside Joven. It be as simple as trust in the body. There was a long silence then, but one broken by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Caliandra came into the firelight with her hands holding a small wooden cup, the sight of which brought a smile to Trem's face. Are you looking for some refreshment? If you don't mind, my lord, the priestess said politely. I've not had much tea since I moved to Delmore, and I miss it. Trem poured some leaves and the remaining hot water into the cup as Joven asked, Where did you come to Delmore from, Caliandra? The priestess set her cup on the ground to cool as she tied her hair back and set herself down, kneeling on the floor. I grew up far to the south, actually, in the Haven Isles. When I became an adult, I chose to devote myself to Endoth and went in search of a village in need of a healer. The tales say no one leaves the Haven Isles, Logan said with a smile. The land is too beautiful and life too peaceful. Supposedly, even the pirates that go to raid the settlements end up simply taking up residence there. Caliandra laughed with genuine mirth at Logan's jest. Yes, it is quite lovely, and my people have turned many to our way of life. My parents chose to stay after trying to make a living as merchants and investigating the Isles for items to sell in Lagotia. It captivated them as it does many, but I found curiosity and devotion to others in need compelled me to leave, and they accepted my choice. A brave decision, Logan said. Perhaps, Caliandra replied, or a natural one for those who wonder about the world beyond their front door. Trem stood abruptly and swallowed the last of his cup. If this journey is going to take several days, we should begin now. Let's get these people up and get on our way. The end of pleasantries was sudden but not uncalled for. The importance of haste was clear to all, adventurers and refugees alike. Though the people of Delmore took some time to wake and assemble, they recognized the necessity of marching on and did not complain. Diaga still would not come out of his deep sleep, so Neep hefted him herself, carrying his body like a child in her arms. Logan had all the people line up before the exit to the cave and address them. People of Delmore, we're traveling to the other side of this cavern, which our guide, Silrastor Gend, tells us was once called the Passage of Chronocarl. It will take us to the continent of Southron. There we'll do our best to find you shelter and supplies. However, the journey may take a great while, at least several days, and we have limited food and water for everyone here. We have wounded, elderly, and the young with us who will need to be helped along. If you can, please leave behind anything that will slow us down. There was some grumbling amid the people, but they complied. Most were just happy to be alive and on the move. Trem turned again as they began to line up before the exit. You and I will stay in the lead. The rest will mix in with the people. You're responsible for finding the path, and as swiftly as possible. The halfling, perhaps affected by the stern and irritable tone Trem had used, simply nodded his assent. They began to trek slowly but steadily. Gend walked just in front of Trem, holding aloft a torch to light the way. Trem's stronger vision was helped greatly by this, and he was one of the few in the caravan that could see the remains of artwork and architecture adorning the walls as they marched. On several occasions he thought he spotted the remains of ancient writing on the stone, in places seemingly written over the carvings carefully etched on the walls. Trem felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise when he wondered whether someone, in a violent fury, had scratched some of the script over meaningful art. The hours of walking and the consistency of such strange sights eventually caused the concern to fade, and, like the others, he concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. The line of refugees stretched far back down the road through the caverns, so far, in fact, that messages had to be passed through the line and would take many minutes to reach one end from the other. Those behind eventually stopped trying to communicate with those in front, and continued to walk as long as whoever occupied the space in front of them was moving forward. As the hours passed with only a very brief pause for the distribution of rations, the groan of wheels and snorting of horses were the only sounds in the tunnels. In the middle of the line, Ghost walked beside Karok, keeping his ornery mount on the opposite side of himself and the people he was watching. Several in his pocket of the column had faltered or slipped as they grew tired, and he began paying particular attention to an older couple that was clinging to one another for support. As the man stumbled yet again, Ghost caught him and, with surprising delicacy, helped him atop Karok with kind words for the passenger and a stern, almost threatening tone for the beast he was clambering onto. He turned and helped his wife up as well, cautioning them to remain vigilant and alert him if Karok proved a poor host. The great horse snorted in response, but plodded forward with markedly more care than he had while walking next to his master. Ghost was watching them go when a voice came, quiet but biting, behind him. Your occasional kindness does not erase everyone's memory of who you are, Napoleon. Caught somewhat unawares, Ghost turned to see Logan standing behind him with arms crossed. Their contentious relationship had softened somewhat with the need for cooperation, but it seemed the younger man wished to rekindle the feud. At that moment, the exile from the north determined it was not worth his time to trade barbs with the Anglodaic, and simply answered, "It keeps the line moving, nothing more." But Logan was not done, and he approached Ghost suddenly, leaning in to speak quietly but in a challenging tone. "I know you care nothing for them, and perhaps even less so for us. Whatever it is you might think you can accomplish going south, it will not wipe away the foulness of your deeds. When we are clear of these tunnels, I expect you to walk your own dark path as soon as you're able. We will not need people of your ilk in our midst." "You seem especially intent on badgering me, knight." Normally the mention of his past would have caused Ghost to recoil in pain at the memory, but he was not going to allow this high-minded man to admonish and judge him so. He leaned in as well, and through gritted teeth came sharp words that pierced Logan's thin armor of righteousness. "You can drop your facade around me, Anglodaic. I'm not a fool. You're on no right to achieve the title of paladin with your people, and if I were you, I'd concoct a better lie to explain your presence here to the others. Some of them are more than clever enough to figure you out." Logan recoiled sharply and stammered out, "I don't know what you're suggesting. I left my home 2 years ago to perform an act that would be honorable enough to draw the attention of the god Paladinus, and am still acting in accordance with the code of our people in my pursuit of his validation." "I know I do not come across as a well-read man," Ghost said, "but my father was quite insistent on the depth and breadth of my studies as a young man. The Ungadic rite calls for quests lasting any length necessary as deemed so by the participant, but few last longer than a year without the candidate admitting failure or dying in the attempt. You may claim you were looking for a cause noble enough to undertake, but had not my home fallen into the coils of that serpent Narath around the time you left your own lands? Do you really expect me to believe you thought there was a more pressing endeavor to throw your sword behind than the hostile takeover of a neighboring nation by one of your god's greatest rivals?" Now Logan was truly off balance, unable to form any sort of response under the verbal onslaught of Ghost, spoken so calmly and matter-of-factly that he had to have put the pieces together some time ago. The Napoleon straightened and stared down his crooked, angular nose at Logan. "I've no interest in revealing your lies, though I do wonder what really drove you out of Agladeus. I also wonder how much you told your fanged friend. With his dog-like loyalty, I doubt you needed to say much to gain his assistance when you left." "Leave Grimtooth out of this, you bastard," Logan hissed. "He's my blood brother. That was enough for him to come along." "Convenient for you," Ghost said. "Now listen very carefully to me. I'm not a man who goes about airing others' secrets or demanding they come clean. Keep your sins, whatever they are, to yourself, knight. But if you ever again dare to pass judgment on me, or feel it your duty to remind me of my failures, remember this: a man as foul as you deem me would have no qualms about killing someone like you." Without another word, Ghost spun on his heel and rejoined the men and women walking steadily down the cavern road. Logan felt his head swimming in shock and frustration as he tried to calm himself after the unexpected turn his conversation with Ghost had taken. The knight had thought to assert some manner of control and authority over what he believed was the most poisonous element in their small, fracturing group. Instead, he felt his own conscience tested and almost undone. He wiped sweat from his brow and tried to slow his racing heart. Logan nearly struck Grimtooth when the orc clapped him on the shoulder. Sensing his blood brother's disturbed mood, Grimtooth tried to find the root of it. "Ah, Logan, what be eating you so?" But strangely, the knight brushed his hand away, and his face became a mask of determination and focus once again. "Nothing. Just a bit tired is all. Let's keep moving." Without waiting for Grimtooth, Logan turned and walked onward at a rapid pace, surpassing the gait of many in the cavern as he sped into the darkness ahead of him. The orc watched him for a time, greatly confused and not a little concerned, before shrugging and helping a few struggling refugees keep their young children going next to a wobbling cart that seemed to be threatening collapse. Whatever was eating at Logan would surely not come to anything of dire importance before they reached the end of the lightless road. The first 2 days of the journey were little more than a blur of marching, brief stops to eat and rotate the young and infirm through the limited spaces allocated to them on the carts, and then rare extended periods of rest when Gen stopped to investigate road signs carved in stone. Diaga had awoken midway through the first day of their trek, and his strength and energy returned rapidly. He soon joined Trem and Gend at the front of the line of survivors and watched every perusal of the wall markings with the curious eye of a scholar. Gend seemed extremely uncomfortable with Diaga's presence, and even more so with his questions about the Dwarven script he was interpreting, particularly those related to how he learned such an archaic language. The halfling always rambled on with some vague explanation and changed the subject, which Diaga feared might mean he was going largely off memory, rather than any actual ability to interpret the runes on the walls. Trem was more supportive of their diminutive guide, and tried to keep his confidence up through the reassurance and gentle chiding of Diaga for his more incisive queries. The mage tried to voice his concerns about their becoming lost in the tunnels, which after the first day had begun to branch off from the main road with increasing frequency, but the half-elf continually reminded him they had little choice but to trust Gend. It was not as though there was another guide there with them, and Diaga had admitted he was unable to read the Dwarven runes here, which were older or of a different dialect than what little Dwarven he had learned in his own studies. Though he did not like the circumstances they were traveling under, Diaga did have to admit Trem was right about them having little choice, and began to consciously limit his pestering of the halfling guide. Instead, the young wizard tried to carry on conversations with his half-elf companion, which was difficult to do, as Trem seemed determined to keep his distance even when he was willing to talk. At times, Diaga was certain he would have had more productive and insightful discussions with Wrath, whose shadow occasionally crept into the corners of his vision. Trem once told Diaga that he suspected the black-clad figure was keeping an eye on his unlikely halfling friend, but also admitted he, too, was sometimes unnerved by the stealth Wrath exhibited flitting about the caves. It was on the third day that Diaga finally worked up the courage to broach a topic with Trem that he had felt compelled to discuss for some time, but had not yet found the chance to mention. Trem was in an unusually conversational mood, explaining his earliest days away from his adoptive parents when he made for the town of Halden Bay in an effort to find some word of his birth mother. As he tried to pass, like a somber cloud, over the subject, Diaga brashly interrupted him. You can't hide forever behind the excuse of being an orphan, or cursed, or whatever woe-begotten tale you tell yourself to validate your guilt and fear, Trem. Among members of our unlikely company, such self-deceptions hold no water. Trem halted and looked at him with such shock and borderline fury that Diaga almost immediately regretted what he'd said, but rather than apologize, he too ceased walking and plunged forward with his argument. Maybe you have overlooked the fact that I and Neep and Grimtooth are all orphans as well, or that Ghost has been through a loss possibly worse than ours, that of his children and wife caused by his own misguided actions. And what about Javanaleth, whose pursuit of his missing father drove him to you? Even Logan told me his mother died giving birth to him, and he holds a deep-seated guilt for his part, however unintended, in her passing. Do you not see that you're not unique in your loss? Trem's initial anger softened as the insight of Diaga's words came through, but he still tried to deflect them. It's not the same. You can't understand. Enough, Diaga shouted, and his authoritative bellow brought the attention of Gend and those at the front of the caravan. Cease your self-pity and excuse-making, and take accountability for your decisions, no matter their defensibility. Even Ghost doesn't try to deny his own reprehensible behavior, though he may wish to hide it to dull the pain it brings him when dragged into the revealing light. Whether you've done good or ill, you can't use the excuse of the gods choosing you as a reason to feel more entitled to grief and mistakes than the rest of us. Was it not those same gods who allowed my parents to be killed, or Grimtooth's? In your loss, you're not unique. All of us who've taken to the aimless wanderings of the road have done so to fill a hole in who and what we are. Your pain and sense of emptiness is common. Did you not yourself say that the world was a harsh and brutal place? Trem had gone quite still. I did. Then accept it. Don't try to excuse your behavior because your misfortune came knocking at your door once or twice more. You say you gave up the dream of being a hero upon realizing the world is not made of tales of good battling evil. Fine, I agree. This world and that of the gods is made of flawed beings fighting over their own beliefs and ideologies. There's no external cause of absolute good or evil. We do either, and the fault or praise for both lies at our own feet. Trem did not speak for a time as Diaga's words hung in the air, and those close enough to have heard his admonishment of the half-elf filed, eyes averted, past them both. Then he gave Diaga a slight nodding of his head, as though acknowledging his words without really accepting them. Someone once told me that, though perhaps phrased a bit differently. I thought him quite wise at the time. Despite himself, Diaga was intrigued. Who was that? Vakhtyn el-Vak, Trem answered flatly, and then he bowed his head and rejoined the column, walking southward through the caves. Diaga, caught unawares by the revelation, did not watch him go, but stared blankly at the space before him where Trem had been for several moments. Then he felt Neep brush up against him reassuringly, and as though he was coming out of a trance, he stroked her fur and allowed her to lead him down the road with the rest of the column, deep in thought, and unsure if he'd made his point to Trem, or had it utterly and unquestionably refuted by him. The third day of travel seemed to bring them to the darkest stretch of the caverns. The shafts of light that sometimes pierced the roof were nowhere to be seen, and the torches, which had been replenished with hay and pitch from the wagons, were a necessity. Moreover, the road itself had become uneven, and in places was covered with debris ranging from shards of rock to items of wood and metal. Several times the travelers stopped to examine what was left lying in the road, but all of it seemed aged and worn to the point of uselessness. Diaga had agreed with Gend. The make of everything they found was Dwarven, but he insisted it was older than most crafts one would find among the dwarves of the present age. It went this way for 3 more days, and the mood of all members of the long line was foul. Even the normally kindly Grimtooth grew sullen and quiet. By that 6th day, Gend was actively trying to cheer them all up, promising they were near the Dwarven settlement of Sunhall, and there would be rest and respite for them there, as well as the good news that they were within a single day's march of the exit. This word spread quickly down the line, and the mood brightened among everyone significantly. The passages became more clearly marked the directions for various smaller settlements, at least according to Gend, and even Trem noticed a distinct difference in the frequency and shape of the symbols. As they began to walk downward into the caves at the beginning of the sixth day, the number of carvings increased. Trem saw several that caught his attention. In the first few, there seemed to be words or directions along with markers suggesting they might have been road signs for underground travelers. Trem noted that Gend stopped to check these markings whenever he encountered a fork. The half-elf watched as the markings began to be accompanied by drawings of what he supposed were dwarves. The short, squat figures were depicted brandishing axes or picks, and usually hammering away at rocks or outcrops and stone walls. In a few cases, he thought he made out the figure of giant clawed creatures carrying the dwarves through the heavy stone, but he could not be sure. The walk went on for several hours. Gend's pace remained steady the entire way, and he eventually started them up several stone ramps. Trem took this as an indication they were nearing the exit, since they were now climbing instead of descending, or traveling on what they had perceived as flattened earth. At last they seemed to find a final massive fork with two impressive stone archways carved above the tunnels. One had ivy leaves down to the smallest detail wrapping about it, with a large sun rising over the height of the arch. Another was decorated with small pieces of gold and silver, along with other fine minerals. Trem assumed this led to a mining region of the caves, but just as he expected, the central one, wrapped in the strange vines with the symbol of the rising sun, led to the surface. But Gend turned to the right tunnel, which appeared to be descending once again. Trem paused and examined the arch, now noticing it too was wrapped in vines, but much thicker and with small thorns. He also thought he could make out the shapes of strange humanoids, clearly not dwarves, coming in among the weaving tendrils. Gend stopped a few feet into the tunnel. "Come on now, this way. We're going to make a stop in Sunhall." Trem looked at the halfling, then brushed the archway to his tunnel. It was smoother and more worn, as though someone had tried to sand away the carvings or portions of them. Trem looked back towards the central path where the column of refugees was waiting. "Are you sure, Gend? I can practically smell the wind from this direction." The halfling smiled disarmingly. "Oh, to be certain, that leads to the surface, but the doors down here can resupply us all. It'll make the journey beyond the passage more bearable, and it's a very short walk from here." Trem hesitated a moment longer, then shrugged. "Well, I suppose you would know best." The archway opened up into a wide, spiraling ramp that, like a screw, spun down into the earth. The caravan continued downward for a short time, just as Gend had promised. The walls in this part of the caves were not dry as they had been before. Moisture clung to the rock and dripped from the ceiling, and though it had been cool beneath the earth during most of the journey, Trem now felt a distinct chill in the air. Gend forged ahead at the same pace as always, and the half-elf matched his speed, though he kept an eye on those behind him to make sure they did not falter. The spiral finally flattened out a few moments later, and Trem could see they were in another massive cavern, this one dripping water from the walls and, improbably, growing strange plants in the gloom. Far above and in the distance he could see a vast opening in the ceiling that, had it been daytime, would have revealed a great deal of light. Gend stepped towards the center and turned. "This is the dwarven settlement of Sunhall. We can rest here, as I said. It's not much farther now." Trem nodded and made room for the rest of the procession. The refugees gratefully laid down their wounded and few remaining belongings for a break they had not expected. The wagons and horses were left above the spiraling ramp, tethered to stone hooks that Gend had helpfully pointed out to the people of Delmore as they entered their long rampway. Standing in the great cavern, Trem was joined by Logan and Joven, while Neep and Diaga wandered off to a nearby alcove to examine the odd things growing about the walls. Logan glanced around and rubbed his thickening facial scruff quizzically. Strange cavern we have. I dare say I've never heard of such a thing." Grimtooth plucked one of the leaves from a nearby plant. "Ach, they be smelling like something terrible, Logan." The knight wrinkled his nose in agreement and Ghost grunted. "If the mage can be bothered, I bet he could tell us more about what this place is. He seems to know about these sorts of things." "This is Sunhall," Gend piped up. "The youngest of the Huldavarn dwarven settlements, founded by Wildan Chronocarl to serve as a trade town connecting Southron and Lagotia." Diaga rejoined them, several samples of the plant life in his possession now, and the dwarves here have not been heard from in centuries. Most believe them to be dead. "It certainly does not look occupied," Ghost agreed. A sudden crash whirled the company around. Across the cavern they heard stones strike the floor, and in the distant soft whisper of leather on rock. Trem waved to the people of Delmore to be quiet, and began sneaking around the foliage and boulders to get a look at the far side of the cave. Trem had his sword drawn, and the knight and Napoleon were slowly following suit, covering his flanks while trying to remain quiet. Joven glanced back behind him and whispered to Diaga, "Where have Gend and Wrath gotten to?" Napoleon waved him into silence as Trem reached his vantage point. The half-elf paused as he studied the odd sight, and then he motioned the others to join him. He pointed around the corner, and they all leaned out to see what he had spotted. The scene beyond was the large rocks that obscured their view of the main portion of the cavern was astounding. Great stalks of strange, brightly colored fungi, and lichen were clinging to the walls, but also sprouting in all directions from the floor. Amid the growths were a number of ramshackle buildings, seemingly on the verge of collapsing, made of stone or some spare bits of wood or perhaps hunks of alien plant life in the cavern. They were of design and form that was impossible to place, and perhaps not meant to be reflective of any one culture or society, for it seemed that the lowest structures had been carefully assembled from professionally cut stone, the work of true artisans. Yet the gaps amid those fine works were filled with hunks of unmatched rock and debris, simply meant to do the job of sealing up holes in the original design. The windows of the low, squat buildings looked to have metal bars in them, not for imprisonment, but the support of glass, but there were no panes in any of the portals, and it gave the whole settlement an uninviting and rather bleak look. Trem and the others could hear, though not see, the dripping and bubbling of flowing water, and it seemed there must be a stream beyond the settlement, which was lit not by torches but by several transparent sacks of indeterminate materials holding writhing swarms of fireflies. Among the faint light that shimmered and shook across the faces of the buildings were shadows of the worn homes and shops, though the purpose of each structure was unclear from design and they bore no signs or symbols to denote their intended use. The scenery itself would have been astounding, but it was enhanced further by a large number of moving forms amid the mushrooms and structures. Several short, stocky figures were wandering around the section nearest the traveler's end of the cave, apparently listening intently. Trem looked back towards the refugees. The somewhat stifled noise of their chatter was drawing the group towards them. Logan hefted his sword in preparation to fight, but Joven stayed his hand, whispering, "Look." As the figures came closer, Trem could make out the distinct beards and thick hair of dwarves. They came slowly and tentatively in the direction of the milling people. They were clad in heavy leather armor, and carried spears and axes, though very crude ones. To Trem they looked rather out of place, like a race of dwarves from long past. Their weapons were of metal, but a roughly forged kind, and their leather armor looked poorly cured. Still, he knew of no dwarves that would wish to bring harm on the refugees of Delmore and or his friends, and Trem sheathed his weapon, turning to the party. "There are dwarves here, as Gen claimed. I doubt they're a danger to us. We should at least greet them instead of hiding behind these rocks." The company made its way slowly out from their hiding spot and approached carefully so as not to startle the mass of dwarves. As soon as they were spotted, the apparent leader, judging by his slightly taller stature and finery, held up his hand and halted his own troops while watching the newcomers patiently. Trem went a few extra steps forward, and he could see there were nearly 50 of them. The half-elf waved in greeting. "Underdwellers," he addressed them in common with their formal name. "I'm Trem Waterhound, and these are my companions. We are merely passing through your realm on our way to the southern lands. We were told we might find you here, and we'd be grateful of any assistance you can offer." The leader of the group, the same slightly larger dwarf with a graying beard and gold circlets banded round several thicker braids, responded in a halting, choppy pattern of speech. "Friends are you to us. We not enemies. We bring food." And with a wave of his hand, the leader sent 20 or so dwarves scurrying away to the settlement behind them, where they began rummaging about loudly and calling to one another in a language none of the adventurers recognized. Trem led the rest of the odd dwarves to the refugees who, though initially frightened by the strangers, were happy when they learned food was to be brought to them. The dwarves also hauled in large tables, crude ones but certainly sturdy enough, along with benches to match. The people of Delmore began to talk excitedly as they realized a real feast was being prepared. Trem stood off to one side of the leader of the dwarves. The strange and slow speech of their kind surprised him, but he presumed they had been living far from outsiders for so long they probably barely kept any knowledge of the common tongue. The dwarves, at least now that they appeared organized, hardly spoke among themselves, and only in strange, haltingly guttural voices. Some of the Delmore refugees tried to engage them, but found they either could not or would not respond. This oddity was forgotten as more and more strange food began to arrive to decorate the table. The leader of the dwarves addressed Trem. "We have King. You, leader of people outside. Come meet King." Trem looked at Logan as though seeking permission, or perhaps hoping the knight would lay claim to the responsibility, but the Angadaik waved him off. "You took up the task of speaking to them, Trem. Go and meet their king. I'm tired of acting as the diplomat. We'll be sure to save you something to eat." Trem waved to the knight in acceptance and strode off to the far side of the cavern with his guide and 2 other dwarves. Jovaneleth sat on the bench and watched the food being slowly piled up onto the massive table before him. Ghost plopped down next to him and snorted. "Doesn't smell like much, but I'll eat anything at this point." Joven smiled and glanced around, then he turned to Ghost. "Where's Trem going?" The Napoleon waved disinterestedly. "Oh, to meet their king, or some such nonsense." Joven took another, harder look around. "And where are Gend and Wrath? They've been missing since the dwarves arrived." Ghost slapped the young man hard in the back. "Stop fretting, boy. I'm sure they'll turn up. Try and enjoy a little respite once in a while." Trem followed the older dwarf back to the end of the cave, though through the strange and ruined settlement. He tried to engage his companion in conversation, particularly with questions about the disheveled and seemingly unsafe conditions of Sunhall, if that was indeed the area he was being led through, but received only curt and vague answers. As he walked through the town, he noticed many eyes watching him from the open windows around dark corners. The whole place seemed to have turned out to see him pass through, which seemed odd but not threatening. They passed the edge of town, and a tunnel appeared before them, well lit and finely carved like those above the spiraling ramp that led to Sun Hall. The leader gestured with one hand. You go there. Meet King. Trem paused and looked at the walls. A clearly human figure with a well-trimmed goatee and slick dark hair of obsidian stone rested on over the entrance to the tunnel. The carving looked newer than those he had seen elsewhere, and at the same time also oddly familiar. Trem turned to his guide. Who's he? I mean, what should I call him? The dwarf shrugged and did not answer, but gestured more earnestly toward the tunnel. Trem looked at the carving once again, but was still unable to place its origin, and so he nodded in thanks and proceeded through the entrance. The tunnel carved gently and at a gradual angle, but the perfect placement and order of wall torches gave it an almost never-ending feel, though Trem guessed he only walked for several minutes. He came to the end with another arch and the same strange figure astride it. Trem paused once again, an odd feeling of foreboding coming over him, and then he stepped into the room. The room was a perfect dome with a fine mosaic tiled floor. Everything about it suggested it was much more recent and better maintained than the other areas the dwarves appeared to inhabit. Trem stepped onto the mosaic and examined it. A large plain with woods and mountains in the background made up the majority of it. The image was well crafted and captivating, and Trem felt he could not tear his eyes away. He could see humans, elves, dwarves, all with incredibly minute details in appearance and dress cleverly composed of glass-like colored tiles. All a wide variety of sizes and used to increase the degree of clarity to a stunning effect. They were depicted hunting, farming, trading, and wandering the various scenes of towns, hills, and forests. To Trem, it seemed like the artwork itself was alive. The lights about Trem seemed to dim, and he glanced up. The wall torches in the hall began to go out one by one. Then, in a circular pattern around the chamber, several sconces dimmed slowly, before ultimately being snuffed out, and the room darkened considerably. Only two of the largest wall torches remained burning across from where Trem stood on the edge of the tiled floor, framing a great black iron throne he had failed to notice upon entering. In its seat, a pile of oddly yellow roses. He expected the trick of the light to bring the arrival of the king he was expected to meet, but a few moments of quiet where nothing stirred told him he was mistaken. Waiting, Trem glanced back down at the mosaic and was horrified to see the sudden changes that had taken place. A thick dark cloud had settled over the pastoral image, and streaks of red and white bolts lanced from the sky. The once peaceful mortal inhabitants were being struck by fire and lightning, or were under attack from strange black-robed creatures and other shadowy monsters appearing from all about them. Before Trem's eyes, the mosaic seemed to move, and he thought he could hear the cries of fear and confusion from it, though he knew that must have been impossible. Trem Waterhound, at last we meet. Trem did not recognize the voice, but the visage that was the same he'd seen over the archway entering the visage was the same he'd seen over the archway entering the throne room. It was a smiling, handsome face, not of a dwarf, but a human man, with an immaculately maintained and oiled goatee beneath smooth, well-kept hair. The figure sighed and sat languidly on the throne, tossing the roses to the ground. You almost made it out, you know. All you had to do was stay in the forest with your nice little hut and your sad little life. Then you could have lived through all of this, for a time at least. You're no dwarf. Trem straightened defensively. Who are you? Ah, the man said, throwing one leg over the arm of the throne. I'm someone you know well, though maybe you don't realize it. Perhaps a shift in appearance. Trem watched agog as the figure reformed, and sitting in the same position was a man with elven features but far more advanced in age. Though he had not seen him clearly in his dreams, Trem recognized this as Garand Oakheart, and this was driven home when the man spoke in his voice. You really do not take advice well, do you? Do you know that? You went back to Delmore, and now the fates of so many more are irreparably altered for the worst. Trem glanced down to find he'd drawn his blade unconsciously. He twirled it restlessly and said, You impersonated Grandfather Forrest and tried to lead me here alone, without the others. Why? What sort of man are you who rules over dwarves and can enter another's dreams in disguise? A loud spurt of laughter followed Trem's impassioned questions. Oh, truly, Trem, you're too much. You really think I'm some sort of petty lord over a load of unwashed dwarves. Can you not see the truth before you? Trem was baffled and slow to respond, so now, rather annoyed at the delay in Trem's understanding, the man continued, swinging his velvet robes forward majestically as he stood. I am Balthazane, the god of betrayers, and you're in my temple. Indeed, all these caverns are mine to hold sway over. I sent one of my most loyal servants to join your little band of adventurers and steer you here, just as I sent my sliths to kill and impersonate the dwarves of Sunhall so many eons ago. Trem snarled in sudden understanding and anger. You're planning on killing my friends, and the people of Delmore. For what? Simply traveling with me? They would have been spared if you'd listened to me, or Garand Oakheart, if you prefer to think of it that way. I was tasked only with ensnaring you and one other. The rest are an unfortunate addition, but one that will please my loyal Slith disciples. They have been without fresh victims for so long. The half-elf spun to leave and warn his companions, but found his path blocked by the robed form of his enemy, having appeared before him without apparent effort. Balthazar smiled unkindly at him. Trem raised his sword to strike. "Get out of my way, fiend. I'm not one of your victims or servants." "Ah, Trem," Balthazar laughed. "What are you thinking of doing? Rushing out there to save your friends, as you call them? Or perhaps you want to run me through with your sword? Well, that won't do. It's time to stop pretending you've lived a life more honorably than is true." Trem felt the blade quivering in his hands. The shaking grew more and more violent as he held it, and Balthazar's eyes bored down on the steel. The blade shimmered and fire lanced across it. Trem grasped it with both hands and tried to steady his command over the weapon. Balthazar's laughter echoed around him. "This is my realm you stand in now, Trem Waterhound, and anything taken in betrayal is mine to rule, and if I want to—" Balthazar's mirth ceased, and he grew impossibly immense, overtaking the room itself. "I can break that which is mine." The sword exploded in Trem's grip. Shards of metal flew from it and embedded in his head, hands, chest, and arms. Trem howled in pain and fell to one knee. Balthazar's laugh returned to rebound off the walls. "Now what will you do, Trem Waterhound? You're not even worth my time. I'll leave you to someone else, the same one who led you here in the first place, and you do not even know whom, do you? A shame, because you will not be able to see them in the dark." And as Balthazar spoke, the last torches went out, and Trem was plunged into complete blackness. That's 27. I'm going to take a brief pause. Okay, chapter 28. Arvadus led the way back into his palace. The large doors of the throne room closed slowly behind the small group as they stalked cautiously down the carpeted hall. Arvadus halted them and waved Calavar to one side, sending Verasho to the other. He continued up the center towards the throne with Lena positioned protectively behind him. Verasho swept back the nearest wall hanging, ensuring no one was lurking behind it, and moved on to the next one. Calavar continued the same process on the other side, pushing back the heavy woven cloth with his warhammer. As Arvadus neared the throne, he thought he caught movement to his right. He paused just as Lena cried out, "Above us!" Vendile appeared on the balcony with a crossbow tucked under one arm and fired. Arvadus turned at the same moment as Lena shouted. The bolt struck him in the shoulder and knocked him back a step. He grunted and pointed his blade to the twin curving stairs beyond the throne. "After him!" But Vendile was just a distraction. From behind the throne itself, two of his guards appeared, swinging aggressively for the returning king. Arvadus deflected the blade of the first, and Lena managed to deter the second by feigning a jab with her sword. Calavar turned to come to their aid, but down the stairs rushed 5 more men, one in the rear with another crossbow. Calavar made a snap decision and sprang into action, intercepting the new arrivals before they could help the other 2 guards. Verasho careened into the men who had charged down the stairs as well, thrusting his staff forward like a spear and catching the first guard in the face, breaking his nose. Verasho spun around another guard and rushed the crossbowman in an attempt to stop him before he could fire. Lena put her back to Arvadus's, and the 2 struggled to fend off the guards attacking them. Arvadus slammed his fist into the chest of his opponent. "Duck!" Lena dove for the floor, and Arvadus's blade cut over her head with shocking speed for such an old fighter. The wild swing forced the second guard back, and Lena was granted an opening. Arvadus set his feet and adopted a defensive stance, calling, "Go after Vendile. Stop him if you can." Lena rolled away from their assailants, pausing to consider helping Arvadus, but Verasho had carved a clear path up the stairs for her, so she flew past the enemy, following in the wake of the prince's barrage. Calavar flattened the foot of one of the guards with his hammer, and he fell screaming to the floor. The High Lord raised his shield to block the swing of the other 2 men attacking him, and backed towards the throne. Lena sprinted past them, but on her way, thrust her sword in the back of the guard with the ruined nose. The crossbowman saw her intent and trained his weapon on her, but Verasho dove, tackling him on the steps and sending them both rolling to the bottom in a fearsome grapple. Lena dodged as one of the soldiers on the stairs gave her a half-hearted swing and began looking around for his best chance of escape. She was now clear of the fighting, and on her way up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Arvadus thrust at the guard he'd driven backward and felt his blade bite through his armor and into his chest. Unprepared, he threw up his metal gauntlet, deflecting the second guard's blade off the steel, and pulled his weapon free. With incredible ferocity, he slashed at his foe's shoulder, hewing the arm nearly off. The guard shrieked and fell writhing to the ground. Arvadus did not stop to finish him, but instead rushed to aid Calavar. Verasho had the archer on the ground and delivered an overhead smash with his staff that split his head in 2. He leapt up, tripping the guard that had swiped at Lena, and started up the stairs. As he glanced back, his father yelled, "Go, my son. We can handle these." Verasco made haste, taking the stairs in leaps and bounds, shouting Lena's name as he went. Arvadas went back to back with Calavar, the two older men catching their breath and sizing up the remaining opposition. Calavar was wheezing slightly, but his ruddy face was split in a mad grin. Can't recall why I gave this up, Arvadas. I feel young again. Verasco glanced back one last time, seeing the two older men ready to strike at their uncertain enemies. Confident they would be able to handle themselves, he redoubled his efforts to find Lena. He heard her calling as he crested the stairs. Reaching the landing of the main balcony, he paused and then broke into a sprint in the direction of Lena's voice as she called out to him, "Here, I'm over here." Verasco sped after her, staff raised, looking for any threat that might be lying in wait. It seemed most people, from servants to Vendile's remaining thugs, had abandoned the hallways as he raced along, trying to train in on the sound of Lena's footsteps and cries. She had not slowed her pace as Vendile's purple robe flitted around a corner and up some stairs. She followed him doggedly. Lena paused briefly, looking back to see that Verasco was still some distance behind her, but coming on as fast as he could. Afraid of losing the usurper, she did not slow her gait, and instead, counting on him to keep up, she spun around a corner and into another long hallway off the main throne room and skidded to a sharp halt. Vendile had frozen suddenly before her and was looking wildly about him as though he'd lost his way. Lena relaxed slightly and gestured at him commandingly. "Vendile, you have nowhere to go." Carcyrus snarled and ripped off his heavy robe, tossing it to the ground. It had slowed his escape, but he'd been loath to leave it behind, as it symbolized his waning authority. Seeing his plans were coming down around him, he looked to his right and saw the hallway turn out of sight of his pursuer, who was still some distance away. Running around the corner, he recognized the door to the alcoves above the council chamber. He threw himself into them and rocketed forward, but as he stood against the railing, he hesitated, now seeing the floor was a fair distance below him. In desperation, he put one foot up on the railing and almost threw himself off it, but then his cowardice took over and he raced back into the hallway and, without considering his destination, burst into another room. Vendile paused inside. This was the study he had formerly occupied as a High Lord, and he briefly thought about how odd it was he had not recognized it when he rushed madly into the room. Without much pause for reflection, he slammed the heavy oak door shut and heaved a large bureau in front of it. He leaned against the obstruction, breathing hard. Vendile had discarded his crossbow and was left with no more elaborate schemes for his escape or victory. In his brief moment of respite, he simply wanted to find a way out of the palace. Vendile glanced around and nearly fell over when he saw Freyan sitting calmly at his former desk as though it were a normal afternoon. The former broken raider was perusing some manual with which Vendile was, intentionally, unfamiliar. As if reading his mind, the former advisor to the false king spoke, not bothering to bring his head up from his reading. "Such a waste of valuable texts in this room. Truly your family must be proud of your lack of knowledge. One would almost suspect you worked harder to maintain your ignorance than some do to overcome it." Freyan slammed the heavy cover shut and turned in the chair, smiling pleasantly. Vendile was livid, but he was too stunned and admittedly a bit unnerved by Freyan's behavior to answer. Never had Freyan been anything but subservient. It was as though a different man sat before him. The slight figure rose from the chair, brushed his smooth, simple robes, and reached out to grab a thin wooden staff. He smiled again at Vendile. Framed around his nondescript face were his long, shining black strands of hair. "You are almost good enough, Carcyrus. I thought your obvious madness might be tamed through my careful interference, particularly if I remained embarrassingly cowed at your beck and call. Still, your family history, which I have been perusing for some time while the ruckus outside has escalated, should have been enough for me to realize you were not capable of ruling. It is probably for the best. I'd have had to remove you before you held the title for very long." Vendile straightened himself, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I gave you a life when you were but a beggar, Freyan. How dare you stand here and tell me you've pulled my puppet strings?" "But I do, even now." Freyan's eyes fell on the strange metal pendant with its 3 dark stones that Vendile was unconsciously clutching in his free hand, the thin chain pressed tightly against the skin about his neck as he pulled it on in anger. The High Lord looked down at his hand and yelled in fury, snapping the chain, but as he held the item outward, ready to discard it, he hesitated. His former advisor smiled unnervingly at him. "Still you cannot rid yourself of it. Your family has a history of insanity and sadistic behavior, but that item enhanced it and made you easier to manipulate, though I fear I allowed it to go too far." "It's just a piece of metal," Vendile insisted, but he still could not release his grasp. Freyan shook his head, apparently ashamed at Vendile's ignorance. "I have, from the first day we met, merely played the role of your servant. I am indeed a servant, but it's not to you, nor will it ever be. This experiment of mine was doomed from the beginning. I will allow my hands to be wasted on such foolish projects no more." Vendile laughed then. "They'll not let you live, Freyan. Arvadas knows well the role you've played. I will not be here to receive his judgment, at least not today." Vendile snarled and slammed his fist, holding the pendant into the wall. "You've nowhere to go, no exit other than out that window, and onto the hard ground below, and I doubt you have the stomach for that." "Ah, and you do." "I will not have to," the madman chuckled. "The code, old Hawking loves it and his pathetic laws. He can't execute a man of the High Lord rank. We can only be imprisoned. If he can escape those dungeons, then so might I. Freyan tapped his staff on the floor and pulled his hood over his head. You'll do no such thing, High Lord Vendile. The wind tells me you'll not outlive this coup, nor will your branch of the family line. Your name dies today. Vendile sputtered in fury, then began to laugh, high-pitched and cackling. And now my former ragged adviser is a true clairvoyant, a speaker of real fortunes, and not some charlatan worming his way into my good graces. What a travesty you are, Freyan, a disgrace even to your vile people. Freyan turned and paused for a final parting shot over his shoulder. The broken are not my people. Goodbye, Carcyrus. Vendile continued to laugh as Freyan walked slowly to the window and pushed the shutters wide. Strapping his staff to his belt, he climbed into the opening. You best grow wings quickly, Freyan, Vendile shrieked hysterically, lest you end as a grease mark on the stones of my kingdom. But Freyan leapt from the high window, and Vendile could not resist rushing to it to watch his former servant's demise. But as he fell, Freyan's shape changed, his black robes pulled in and collapsed. His limbs, his feet seemed to spread across his body. Then a raven flew like a bolt up past the window, and with a last cry it zipped away, heading south towards the tall, imposing woods of Silverleaf Forest. Vendile stood stunned with his hands on the window frame, unable to comprehend what had happened. Then he heard the snapping of wood and spun to see a blade appearing in the door jamb. It shot up and down, trying to snap the thin wood block as someone slammed against the heavy door. Vendile's eyes flitted back and forth. He held up his hands before his face and tried to will a similar change to Freyan's own in them. Lena threw her weight into the door again. She had dashed around the corner after Vendile, finding an empty hall with closed doors and no sign of her quarry. She directed Verasho to cover their enemy's escape in case he had hidden and was waiting for her to enter the wrong room so he could slip past her. Verasho had called from behind her, pleading with Lena to wait as he sped towards her position, but Lena could only see the face of Graham contorted in unending sorrow as he clutched Derek's body. She was determined to reach Vendile first. She'd recognized the finery of the doors to the council chamber, but even more importantly, the bat-shaped seal on the knob of Vendile's study. Guessing correctly, she tried to enter Vendile's quarters and been rebuffed, but heard the voices beyond. Her slight body slammed into the heavy door again, and the bureau, filled at its top with fine jewelry of extraordinary weight, tipped and fell inward, its base cracking the door as it ground against it. Lena hacked the door with her sword to finish the job, and then she was within the chamber. Vendile was at the desk, his back turned to her, in his left hand, a thin metal chain running through some strange medallion beneath it, resting on the pages of an old volume. The page that was to the right was blank, but Lena did not pause to consider why Vendile would be looking at an unfinished book. She crept towards him, and he looked up almost immediately. She stopped and raised her sword, for his eyes were wild with madness. Lena steadied the blade. Don't move, Snake. You're staying right here until my friends come. Lena thought she could hear Verasho's footsteps in the hall and his voice calling loudly for her, but she was fixated on her target. Vendile's fingers slid slowly off the page, and the bauble and chain fell to the floor. Of course, my dear. He took a step towards her. No need to threaten me. I'm done for. Lena thrust the blade forward, stopping his advance. Not another move, or I'll carve out your eyes. Vendile curled his lip in a half snarl, but he took a half step back. A cry came loudly down the hall, and Lena recognized Verasho's voice. She called out, Here! I have him in here! Vendile relaxed in front of her, and Lena heard Verasho's voice calling to her again, now closer but unsure. She looked over her shoulder and shouted, In here! I'm in! Lena's hand released the sword, and she slumped. Her body seemed to fold, and she had trouble looking up. Vendile's rough facial hair brushed against her forehead as he slowly pulled free the dagger he'd driven under her ribs. Lena felt the blood rise in her mouth and coughed. Bright red flecks spattered onto his cheek as Vendile lowered her to the floor. Lena continued to cough, struggling to breathe. Vendile straightened and stepped over her prostrate form and into the doorway. He caught sight of Verasho coming around the corner as he paused, looking desperately from side to side. Vendile sprang from the doorway and took off back towards the observation platform above the council hall. Verasho reached the open door and immediately saw the crumpled form of Lena. He stopped short and fell to his knees, crying, Lena! The young woman coughed a few times and more blood foamed and ran down the side of her mouth. Verasho cradled her head, letting his staff fall to the floor. Lena, oh gods, Lena, hold on. I'll get you to Calavar or the priests. But as he began to straighten and pull her with him, a terrible grip seized his arm and held him back. She mouthed a few words, but Lena Engrove's mouth was full of blood, and she could not speak. Verasho tried again to raise her from the ground, but she held him fast and coughed again, red flecks spattering across Verasho's armor. The eldest Hawking's son was openly crying now. Lena, please, don't make me do this. Lena's eyes bored into him, and even as they looked beyond his face, and then her body slumped hard into dead weight and the blue orbs glazed over. Verasho watched his tears hit her face as it relaxed, and she seemed to reach a peaceful yet inhuman state. Verasho cradled her as the blood continued to spread across the floor in a bright crimson pool. Lena felt heavy in his arms, and he had to place her head on the ground. He went to reach for his staff, just to have something to lean on, and a smooth, soft velvet boot pinned it to the ground. Verasho looked up to see Vendile, whom, having seen the weakness in Verasho's grief, had once again abandoned his risky attempt at escape, looming over him. He held a bloody knife in his hand and smiled madly. A shame, really. She was lovely enough for a future concubine. But you see, I'll have plenty when I go to the invaders and get my own army, something I should have done before, instead of playing games with your foolish father. Vendile kicked Verasho in the face, sending him sprawling. He bent and tossed the staff behind him and walked forward. Freyan flew the coop. His laughter was hysterical, and his speech rapid and broken. And now I have to get out on my own. I think I might just ask your father how he did it through those dungeons, but I'll be sure to bring him with me, so I can leave a trail of blood for his loyal subjects to follow. Verasho rolled to his side and up on one knee. You're insane. I'm not letting you anywhere near my father. Vendile laughed even louder. Oh, don't fret, little Hawking. I intend to kill you first. The mad High Lord lunged, but Verasho was too quick, rolling away from him. The crazed nobleman recovered swiftly and slashed Verasho across the arm. Gritting his teeth, the prince hurled himself through the air, backward after his staff. Vendile rushed him, but Verasho got hold of the weapon and swung it at almost the same moment. The heavy metal staff slammed into Vendile's kneecap just as he neared Verasho. Howling in pain, the High Lord went down. The prince hopped, cat-like, to his feet and swung again, knocking the knife free and backing a now limping Vendile against the wall. He fell onto his back and scrabbled away from Verasho in fear. The High Lord attempted to rise, but Verasho kicked him onto his back. Vendile raised his hands defensively. Please, you can't kill me. I invoke the code. I invoke the law. You can't kill a man without proper trial and justice. Verasho slowed, lowering his staff. Vendile's smile was sickly sweet. And I know you, young Hawking. The code is your life. You'll not betray it like your foolish brother. You have morals and rules to guide you. I know you. I know your family. Verasho looked down at Lena's prone form lying peacefully on the tiles of his kingdom's palace. He hefted his staff and glared sidelong at Vendile. My family, he whispered, will understand if I overlook the law this one time. Vendile screamed as the heavy staff smashed into his face, again and again, until he could scream no longer, and even then Verasho continued the beating until a hand caught the bloodied end of his staff, raised for another blow. Spattered in blood and tissue, he turned to see his father's eyes filled with tears. Verasho released the staff and heard its steel crashed into the marble floor as though it were miles away. Justice is done. You're the king again, sire. Arvadas was left staring at the bloody massacre before him. Califar over his shoulder did not stay to speak, but gathered Lena's body gently and left with it as quietly as he could. Arvadas did not cry. In that moment he resolved to hold back his tears for his family and nation, broken as they were. He knelt and picked up his son's heavy staff, feeling the slippery grip of blood-drenched scales beneath his worn fingers. He could not raise it, but tossed it to the ground again and sat on the floor, head slumped. The cost of his victory fell upon him. The pain settled deep and irremovable within him. And worst of all, the knowledge that for all this death he had gained only the right to command a country trapped in its own borders, with no idea still how to save them. The battle had changed nothing, for Arvadas Hawking was still alone. Alright, so that's chapter 28, and I will be picking up with chapter 29. I'm going to go get these videos up on YouTube for those who want to catch them later, so that they're still there when the VODs expire. As always, if you want to reach out to me, it's at Legacy Chronicle on Twitter, or you can email me at trevorhpaul@gmail.com. One announcement is that coming up at the end of this month, the beginning of November, 2nd through the 4th, I will be at Rhode Island Comic Con in Providence. So if you're in the area, stop by. I will have both the 3rd edition of the sword and the 2nd edition of the shield available for sale. Those are going to come with some new features and some improved, a couple of edits to fix a few of the grammatical mistakes, particularly in the sword, but also some improvements to the cover so that it's a little easier to distinguish between the two of them when they're on your shelf. That was something that we discovered was hard to do when you put them next to each other, which one is which. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I will hopefully be back tomorrow to do some more chapters.